October 12, 1492, in his journal, Columbus marveled that the Taíno gave with all their hearts, then immediately calculated how easily they could be enslaved. Most histories end the story there. But what followed was worse than you imagine. Within months, shipwrecked Spaniards turned La Navidad into a nightmare of violence. Women were abducted and villages ruined, triggering all-out bloodshed. This moment marks the true beginning of a conquest far more brutal than legend admits, and now we pull back the curtain on what really happened next. On Christmas Day, 1492, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground off the coast of northern Haiti. The local Taíno leader, Guacanagari, offered help salvaging the wreck. Using the timbers, Columbus ordered the construction of a small fortress he named La Navidad, leaving behind 39 of his men. These men were meant to represent Spanish authority and friendship, but without Columbus's supervision, any pretense of goodwill collapsed. Within weeks, the garrison began roaming the surrounding villages, seizing food, kidnapping women, and committing acts of sexual violence. The Taíno, who had welcomed the strangers with food and shelter, found themselves preyed upon in their own land. Columbus had promised his hosts that his men would behave, but the reality was chaos and brutality. Reports from the time, including Columbus's own letter to the Spanish monarchs, described the settlers as having committed 1,000 excesses that left them mortally hated by the Indians. By the time Columbus returned in November 1493, the fort was a charred ruin. Not a single Spaniard had survived. The Taíno, led by Cacique Caonabo, had risen up and killed the entire garrison, leaving their bodies as a warning. The violence at La Navidad shattered any illusion of peaceful contact. The Spanish response would be swift and merciless. The first blood had been drawn by men who believed themselves untouchable. Their actions, unpunished and unchecked, set the tone for everything that followed. Gold became the currency of survival in Hispaniola after Columbus imposed a new law in 1495. Every Taíno who was 14 years or older was ordered to deliver a hawk's bell filled with gold dust every 3 months. These bells, small metallic trinkets from Europe, became the measure of a life's worth. For the Spanish crown, gold was proof that the venture could pay its debts. For the Taíno, it was a demand most could not possibly meet. In regions without gold, Columbus substituted the tribute with 25 pounds of cotton. Anyone who delivered their quota received a token to wear around their neck as proof. Those without it were marked as defaulters, vulnerable to whatever punishment the authorities chose to inflict. Columbus's orders were clear. Obedience and tribute came above all else. His letters to the monarchs stressed that the people would make good and skilled servants, and that gold could be gathered in incalculable quantities. But the island's rivers and streams yielded little. The quotas ignored the reality of the land, setting up entire communities for failure. Defaulters faced seizure, forced labor, or shipment to Spain as slaves. Hundreds died in transit, their deaths unrecorded in the ledgers. The hawk's bell, once a symbol of exchange, became a tool of terror. The policy criminalized daily existence, turning the act of survival into an offense. Under Columbus's rule, the law itself became a weapon, one that would soon invite even greater brutality. Bartolomé de las Casas arrived in the Caribbean as a young man, expecting to find a new world of promise. Instead, he became the most damning witness to what the Spanish unleashed. In his own words, the soldiers treated the Taíno not as people, but as objects for their amusement. He wrote that men would bet on whether they could split a living body in half with a single sword stroke. Some wagered on who could behead a Taíno with one swing of a pike. There was no anger or fear in these acts, only boredom and bravado. Las Casas described how, in the evenings, groups of soldiers would gather, laughing, as they tested the sharpness of their blades on unarmed captives. No names are recorded for the victims. They were simply there, forced to stand and wait as soldiers made sport of their deaths. The violence was not the chaos of battle, but a cold routine repeated for entertainment. Las Casas' account, written years later, still carries the weight of disbelief. He called it a slaughter of livestock, not warfare. The Spanish, he said, had lost all sense of restraint or humanity. Through these testimonies, the scale of cruelty becomes impossible to ignore, not as isolated acts, but as a pattern that defined daily life for the Taíno under Spanish rule. The horror was not only in the killings, but in the casual way they were carried out, as if human life had no value at all. By 1497, the Spanish crown authorized a new system that would define life and death on Hispaniola, the encomienda. On paper, it promised protection and Christian instruction for the Taíno in exchange for their labor. In reality, it was a legal fiction that handed entire villages and the land they lived on to Spanish settlers. These grants, recorded in the royal archives as capitulaciones, assigned not just territory, but the people themselves. Encomenderos, often men with royal favors or military backgrounds, were given quotas to fill: gold from the mines, cassava from the fields, bodies for the workshops. Each grant spelled out the names of the caciques and the number of workers owed. The law insisted that the Taíno were not slaves, but every day told a different story. The mines became death traps. Forced to dig for gold in narrow shafts, Taíno men worked for weeks without rest. Reports from the period reveal staggering mortality. Most did not survive more than a few months underground. Women and children, assigned to cassava plantations, faced endless cycles of planting and harvest, their labor feeding both the Spanish and the mining camps. The so-called protection of the encomienda was a hollow promise. Encomenderos rarely bothered with religious instruction or basic care. Instead, they drove the Taíno harder, knowing that replacements would come as long as there were survivors left to assign. This system was enforced not just by the threat of violence, but by the law itself. The Spanish crown's legal codes gave settlers the right to extract tribute, labor, and obedience. For the Taíno, there was no appeal, no court, no advocate, no relief. The encomienda turned every Spanish settler into a master and every Taíno into property. The machinery of conquest was no longer just a matter of swords or bells. It was written into the very structure of colonial rule. Spanish soldiers brought more than swords to the Caribbean. From the ports of Seville, they shipped over massive mastiffs and lean-to greyhounds, animals bred for war and trained to hunt people. Shipping records from 1494 to 1508 list dozens of dogs imported to Hispaniola, their passage paid for with royal funds. These dogs became the living weapons of Spanish terror. Bartolomé de las Casas, who witnessed their use firsthand, wrote that a pack could tear apart 100 men in an hour. The handlers unleashed them on runaways and rebels, but also on anyone who hesitated or failed to obey. The fear of the dogs spread faster than the soldiers themselves. Villages emptied at the distant sound of barking. Mothers hid their children in the forest, knowing that even the thickest brush could not stop a trained mastiff. The cruelty did not end with the hunt. Las Casas recorded how the Spanish kept the dogs hungry and aggressive by feeding them human flesh. Some handlers tossed the bodies of the dead to their animals as a reward. In the most chilling accounts, infants were taken from their mothers and thrown to the dogs to keep them blooded. The dogs, once companions and guardians in Europe, became instruments of calculated horror in the Caribbean. For the Taíno, there was no safety in flight, no refuge in the wild. The dogs could find anyone, anywhere. The message was clear: resistance would be met not only with steel, but with teeth. The terror these animals inspired would haunt the island long after the barking had faded. Pigs and cattle arrived on Hispaniola in 1493, brought by the Spanish as living cargo. Released onto the island, these animals multiplied quickly and roamed wherever they pleased. The arrival of livestock upset the island's balance. The Taíno had always farmed collectively, tending conuco gardens, mounds of earth where they grew cassava, sweet potatoes, beans, and maize. There were no fences. Their crops depended on careful rotation and the balance of seasons. The newcomers shattered that balance. Hogs rooted through the gardens, tearing up cassava plants and devouring young shoots. Cattle trampled the mounds, flattening entire fields in a single night. Reports from Spanish officials in the first decade of colonization warned that the Taíno were losing their harvests, but the warnings went unheeded. The Spanish saw the livestock as proof of progress and wealth, not as a threat to survival. By the late 1490s, the Taíno food system was collapsing. Families who once harvested what they needed now faced empty gardens and barren hillsides. Hunger spread from village to village, stripping away the last safety net for a people already forced into mines and plantations. There was no way to protect the crops. The animals belonged to the settlers, and killing them could bring deadly retaliation. Starvation closed off every escape. The Taíno, who had never known famine before the arrival of the Spanish, now watched as their children wasted away. Their knowledge of the land could not save them from animals that did not belong, or from a system that valued livestock above lives. The destruction of the conuco gardens did not happen by accident. It was a weapon that left the Taíno with nothing but despair. In the shadow of hunger and violence, hope collapsed. The Taíno, once known for their generosity and resilience, faced a world stripped of meaning. Starvation crept into every home as the gardens failed, and the mines swallowed their fathers and sons. There was no safety, no promise of mercy from the Spanish overlords. What followed was a silence that missionaries struggled to explain, a hush spreading across villages where laughter and music had once filled the air. Ramon Peña recorded the aftermath in his letters, describing families that seemed to vanish overnight. Las Casas, too, wrote of a sorrow so deep that it could not be measured with numbers. Mothers, unable to feed their children or shield them from forced labor, made choices that defy understanding. In whispered stories, they spoke of mothers ending their own children's suffering, and of men and women turning to the only escape left, the bitter juice of raw cassava. The root, a staple in their diet, became deadly when uncooked, its juice laced with cyanide. Drinking it was a final act of control in a world gone mad. No census counted these deaths, and no Spanish chronicler recorded their names. But the accounts agree. Thousands chose death over chains. Whole families disappeared, leaving behind empty homes and silent fields. The Spanish found villages deserted, the fires cold, the gardens overgrown. For the Taíno, self-destruction was not surrender, but a refusal to live as property. The land itself bore witness to a grief so profound that even the conquerors could not comprehend it. In the western valleys of Saragua, Anacaona, known as the Golden Flower, held her people together through years of disaster. She was famed for her wisdom and diplomacy, the widow of Caonabo and sister to Behechio, both powerful caciques. In 1503, with the Spanish demanding tribute and rebellion simmering across Hispaniola, Anacaona welcomed the new governor, Nicolas de Ovando, to a great feast. Dozens of Taíno nobles gathered in the longhouse, trusting her promise of peace, but Ovando had already decided their fate. At a prearranged signal, Spanish soldiers barred the doors and set the building ablaze. 80 chiefs died within minutes. Anacaona was dragged outside, accused of treason and hanged in public out of respect for her rank. Las Casas later wrote that horsemen impaled children who tried to escape the flames. The massacre at Charagua destroyed the last organized Taíno resistance on Hispaniola. 9 years later, in 1512, the story moved to Cuba. Hetue, a cacique who had fled the violence on Hispaniola, led a desperate campaign to warn the island's people about the Spanish. He was captured and sentenced to burn at the stake. As the flames were prepared, a priest urged him to convert so his soul could go to heaven. Hatue asked, "Are there Spaniards in heaven?" When told yes, he replied, "Then I choose hell." Las Casas preserve these words as a testament to defiance. In the face of betrayal and slaughter, the courage of leaders like Anacayona and Hatue endures, proof that the Taíno spirit did not vanish quietly, even as their world was being erased. On Hispaniola, the scale of loss can be measured in numbers that defy belief. In 1492, estimates of the Taíno population ranged from 300,000 to as high as 3 million. By the time Spanish officials conducted a census in 1514, only 22,000 remained. Less than 30 years later, in 1542, the count fell below 200. These are not just statistics, they are the record of a civilization dismantled in a generation. The causes were not hidden in the shadows of history. Forced labor, starvation, and violence carried out in the name of empire left the island almost empty. Smallpox and other diseases would come, but the collapse had already begun before the first epidemic swept the land. As the numbers dwindled, a debate erupted in Spain. Bartolomé de las Casas, who had once benefited from the encomienda, became the most outspoken critic of Spanish rule. He argued before King Charles V and the royal court that the Taíno were fully human, capable of reason and deserving of rights. His testimony, drawn from years witnessing the cruelty firsthand, forced the crown to confront the reality of what was happening in its new world. The result was the new laws of 1542, a royal decree meant to end the enslavement of indigenous people. Yet even this moment of conscience came with its own tragedy. In seeking to protect the survivors, Las Casas suggested importing Africans as laborers, reasoning that they were stronger and more likely to survive. The moral reckoning was incomplete. The destruction of the Taíno was counted and debated, but never truly answered. For those who survived, the law arrived too late, and for those who did not, only the numbers remain. Centuries later, genetic studies confirm Taíno DNA endures in millions across the Caribbean. Genocide failed to erase the people Columbus tried to silence, yet history textbooks still downplay their fate. As indigenous voices reclaim their heritage worldwide, the legacy of erasure remains a battle fought in classrooms and memory. Survival is written in blood, but justice is written in truth. Share your thoughts on what still needs to change.